In a world where mercy was seen as weakness and love across enemy lines meant death, one woman dared to make an impossible choice. Freya had spent her entire life being mocked, ridiculed, dismissed as the strange blacksmith's daughter who would never be wanted by any man. But on the night her village burned, when she stumbled over a dying warrior bearing the enemy's mark, she discovered something more powerful than hatred, more dangerous than any blade: compassion. She saved the life of the man who had destroyed everything she knew. And in doing so, she ignited a love so fierce it would force two warring peoples to question everything they believed about honor, loyalty, and what it truly means to be strong. As secrets unravel and betrayal closes in from all sides, Freya and Eric must face an impossible truth. Their love might be the very thing that saves them both, or the weapon that destroys everything they fought to protect. But when the moment comes to choose between the man she loves and the people she's sworn to protect, Freya will discover that some choices don't just change your life, they change the course of history itself. The sky over Skarn turned crimson long before the sun had a chance to set. It was an unnatural red, the kind that made mothers clutch their children closer and old men whisper prayers to forgotten gods. Freya stood at the entrance of her father's forge, her hands still blackened with soot from the day's work, watching as that impossible color spread across the heavens like spilled wine on linen. For a heartbeat, everything was silent. Then the screaming began. The Vikings came from the north, their long ships cutting through the coastal fog like blades through flesh. They moved with terrifying precision, a wave of fur and steel that crashed against the village with the force of a winter storm. Freya heard the first clash of metal against metal, felt the ground tremble beneath boots that had crossed frozen seas to bring destruction to her home. The thatched roofs caught fire so quickly it seemed the flames had been waiting, hungry and patient, for this very moment. Her father's voice cut through the chaos, rough and urgent. "Run, girl, to the hills!" But Freya's feet wouldn't move. She stood frozen, watching her world collapse into smoke and embers. A woman she'd known since childhood ran past, her dress aflame, her screams raw and animal. The blacksmith's daughter had always been different, too tall, too strong, too willing to speak when women were expected to stay silent. The village had mocked her for years, whispered that no man would want a bride who smelled of iron and spoke like a warrior. Now, as terror painted itself across familiar faces, those same people rushed past her without a second glance. The heat finally moved her. Freya ran, her lungs burning with smoke, her eyes streaming tears that carved clean paths down her soot-stained cheeks. She knew every corner of Skarn, every hidden path and forgotten doorway. The old forge, the one her grandfather had abandoned years ago when his hands grew too weak to lift the hammer, stood at the edge of the village. It was half collapsed, more ruin than shelter, but it was away from the flames. She stumbled through the smoke, her vision blurred, her heart hammering against her ribs like her father's hammer against an anvil. That's when she saw him, or rather, when she fell over him. Her boot caught on something solid, and she went down hard, her palms scraping against stone and dirt. At first, she thought it was debris, another casualty of the destruction. Then she saw the blood. It pooled around him, dark and thick, reflecting the fire-red sky above. He was massive, even lying broken on the ground. His armor was different from anything she'd seen. Leather and iron worked together in patterns that spoke of northern lands and frozen seas. The emblem on his chest plate made her stomach drop, a raven with spread wings, the mark of the raiders who were destroying everything she knew. This was one of them. This was the enemy. Freya should have run. Every instinct screamed at her to leave him there, to let him bleed out among the ruins he'd helped create. Her hands trembled as she started to push herself up, to continue her escape. But then he opened his eyes. They were blue, not the soft blue of summer skies or gentle streams, but the piercing, impossible blue of glacial ice, of northern lights dancing over frozen wastelands. Even clouded with pain, they held a depth that made her breath catch. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment the world seemed to stop its spinning. There was no judgment in those eyes, no mockery like she'd seen in the faces of village men. Just pain and something else. Recognition, perhaps, or resignation. His lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear over the roar of flames and distant screams. Blood trickled from the corner of his mouth, and she watched as he tried to lift his hand, only to have it fall back to the ground, powerless. Something inside Freya broke, or perhaps it awakened. She'd spent her entire life being told she was too much, too different, too impossible to love. She'd forged metal with her own hands, felt the thrill of taking something raw and shaping it into something beautiful and strong. This man, this enemy, was broken, and every instinct she'd been forced to suppress, every healing impulse her mother had taught her before the fever took her, surged forward. "You're a fool," she whispered to herself, even as her hands moved to check his wounds. "A damned fool, Freya." The old forge wasn't far. She looked around, seeing no one in the immediate chaos. The fighting had moved deeper into the village, following the line of houses toward the market square. With strength born of years working the bellows and lifting iron, she grabbed him under the arms and began to drag him. He was impossibly heavy, dead weight that seemed to fight her every step. Her muscles screamed in protest, but she didn't stop. The abandoned forge was dark and thick with dust. She pulled him inside, concealing him behind old canvas sheets and broken equipment her grandfather had left behind. His breathing was shallow, irregular. She could see at least 3 serious wounds, any one of which might kill him if left untreated. Part of her hoped they would. It would be easier that way, cleaner. She could walk away, tell herself she'd tried, but she didn't walk away. As the sounds of battle raged outside, Freya found herself tearing strips from her underdress, pressing them against his wounds to slow the bleeding. Her hands moved with practiced efficiency, guided by memories of helping her mother tend to injured villagers, back when healing hands were still welcome in Skarn. Dawn came slowly, reluctantly, as if afraid of what it might reveal. The sounds of fighting had faded into an eerie silence broken only by distant weeping and the crackle of dying fires. Freya hadn't slept. She'd kept pressure on his wounds, changed the makeshift bandages when they soaked through, and wondered repeatedly what madness had possessed her. As pale light filtered through the cracks in the walls, she approached him again. His color was slightly better, his breathing more regular. She reached out to check his pulse, and his hand shot up, catching her wrist with surprising strength. Those ice-blue eyes opened again, clearer now, focused and intense. "Eric," he said, his voice like gravel and smoke, carrying an authority that even pain couldn't diminish. It wasn't a question. It was a statement, an introduction, perhaps a warning. Freya's blood ran cold as understanding crashed over her. This wasn't just a warrior. The quality of his armor, the confidence in his gaze despite his injuries, the way he'd spoken his name like a proclamation. This was their leader. This was the man who had commanded the attack on Skarn, who had brought fire and death to her home. And she, the blacksmith's daughter, whom everyone mocked and dismissed, had just saved his life. The days that followed blurred together like iron heated too long, melting at the edges until time itself seemed formless. Freya became a ghost in her own village, slipping between the ruins with practiced silence, always careful, always watching. The people of Skarn had begun the slow, painful work of rebuilding. Hammers rang out against wood and stone, a rhythm that should have comforted her but only made her heart race with fear. Every sound felt like an accusation, every glance a potential discovery. She told her father she needed time alone to grieve, that the smoke had damaged her lungs and she required the cleaner air of the old forge to recover. He'd looked at her with those knowing eyes, weathered and sad, but he hadn't questioned her. The old blacksmith had always understood that his daughter was different, that she needed space the way fire needs air to breathe. He let her go, never suspecting that his compassion was sheltering the very man who'd orchestrated their suffering. 3 times a day, Freya made the journey to the abandoned forge. She carried water stolen from the well, herbs gathered from the forest edge, strips of clean linen torn from her own dwindling supply of clothes. Each time she pushed open that creaking door, she expected to find him dead. Each time those ice-blue eyes would open and track her movements with an intensity that made her skin prickle with awareness. Eric was a terrible patient. Even weak and fevered, he fought her ministrations, growling protests in his Norse tongue when she cleaned his wounds too roughly or forced him to drink bitter healing teas. But he was also surprisingly docile in moments, watching her work with a curiosity that felt almost childlike. He'd never been cared for like this, she realized. Men like him gave orders and expected obedience. Gentleness was foreign to him, perhaps even suspect. "Why?" he asked on the fourth day, his English rough but understandable. The word hung between them like smoke. Freya didn't look up from the bandage she was wrapping around his ribs. "Why what? Why save me? Your people. I brought death to them." Her hands stilled. It was a question she'd asked herself 100 times in the darkness, lying awake in her own bed, wondering if she'd damned her soul. "I don't know," she finally said, and it was the truth. "Maybe because everyone else has already decided what I am, what I'm worth. Maybe I was tired of letting them be right." He studied her face with those unsettling eyes. "And what are you worth, daughter of the Forge?" "More than they think," she said, meeting his gaze with a defiance that surprised them both. "More than you think, probably." Something shifted in his expression then, a crack in the armor he wore even without his steel. "I believe you," he said simply, and the way he said it made her chest tighten with an emotion she couldn't name. The conversations grew longer as his strength returned. Eric told her about the frozen fjords of his homeland, about seas so cold they could kill a man in minutes, about the northern lights that danced like gods across winter skies. He spoke of honor and duty, of a culture where a man's word was more binding than chains, where death in battle was glory, and cowardice was a fate worse than any hell. Freya found herself sharing things she'd never told anyone. About her mother, who'd died when she was 12, leaving her alone in a world that didn't know what to do with a girl who preferred the forge to the kitchen. About the loneliness of being different, of watching other girls her age marry and bear children while she remained unwanted, unmarked, unclaimed. About the secret satisfaction she felt when her blades came out sharper than her father's, even though she could never acknowledge it. "They mock you," Eric said one evening, his voice stronger now, edged with something that might have been anger. "I heard them during the raid. One man said the blacksmith's strange daughter would probably die alone, that even Vikings wouldn't want such a creature." Freya's jaw tightened. "They've said worse. They're fools." He sat up straighter, wincing at the pull of healing wounds. "You remind me of iron, you know. Everyone thinks it's hard, unbreakable. But I've worked the forge too, in my youth. Iron isn't strong because it's hard. It's strong because it endures the fire, bends without breaking, and comes out sharper for the heat." He paused, his eyes holding hers. "You are like that. Fire-tested, unbreakable. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever seen her that way." Freya felt something warm and dangerous unfurl in her chest, something that had nothing to do with the smoke-stained forge around them. But outside their hidden sanctuary, danger was tightening like a noose. Anders, a young man who'd pursued Freya with clumsy persistence for 2 years, had begun to notice her absences. He'd see her slipping away at odd hours, always toward the old forge, always alone. His infatuation had curdled into suspicion, and suspicion in a frightened village was as deadly as any blade. He started following her, staying just far enough back to avoid detection. He watched as she carried supplies she shouldn't have, moved with purpose that suggested she wasn't simply mourning in solitude. He told his friends, and they told others, and soon whispers began to spread like the fires that had nearly consumed them all. The blacksmith's daughter was hiding something. The strange girl who'd never fit in was acting even more strangely. Some said she'd been touched by the raid, her mind broken by the violence. Others suggested darker things, witchcraft and curses and bargains made with the raiders themselves. Freya felt the shift in the air, saw it in the way people's eyes slid away from hers in the village square, heard it in the sudden silences when she approached. Fear was replacing mockery, and fear was far more dangerous. Mockery kept her isolated. Fear might get her killed. On the 8th night, she arrived at the forge to find Eric standing. He was still weak, leaning heavily against the stone wall, but he was upright. In the dim light filtering through the broken roof, he looked every inch the warrior chief he was, tall and broad-shouldered. his Norse features sharp and proud, despite the healing wounds that still marked his body. "I'm strong enough to travel," he said without preamble. "I need to return to my people. They'll think I'm dead. Without my leadership, there will be chaos, maybe civil war among the clans." Freya's heart clenched. She'd known this moment would come, had even prayed for it in her weaker moments. But now that it was here, she felt only a hollow ache. "When?" "Tomorrow night, under cover of darkness." He moved toward her, each step careful but determined. "But first, I need you to understand something." He was close now, close enough that she could see the ring of darker blue around his irises, smell the herbs and leather and something essentially him. "You gave me back my life, Freya, daughter of fire and iron. In my culture, that creates a debt that can never fully be repaid. But more than that," he reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her face with a gentleness that seemed impossible from such calloused hands. "You've shown me something I'd forgotten existed: mercy, compassion, the possibility that strength doesn't always have to break things." Freya's breath caught. "Eric." "One day," he said, his voice low and fierce with promise, "under the same fire-red sky where you found me, I will return for you. Not as a raider, not as an enemy, but as a man who finally understands what's worth fighting for." He kissed her then, soft and careful, as if she were something precious that might shatter. Freya melted into it, her hands finding his shoulders, feeling the solid warmth of him, the life she'd fought so hard to preserve. It was gentle and devastating all at once, a moment stolen from the jaws of impossible circumstances. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Freya saw her own fear reflected in his eyes. Promises in their world rarely survive the dawn. They both knew it. But in that moment, wrapped in shadows and possibility, they let themselves believe. Outside, Anders crouched in the darkness, watching through a gap in the stones, his face twisted with betrayal and rage. He'd seen enough. Tomorrow, everyone would know what the blacksmith's daughter had done. The weeks crawled by like wounded animals, each day heavier than the last. Eric's strength returned in increments, his body remembering its power, muscles regaining their definition beneath skin that had gone pale during his confinement. Freya watched the transformation with mixed emotions, pride warring with dread. Every improvement meant he was closer to leaving, closer to returning to a world that would take him away from her forever. But leaving proved harder than either of them anticipated. Each morning, Eric would announce that tonight would be the night, that he'd slip away under cover of darkness and make his way back to his people. And each evening when Freya arrived with food and fresh bandages, their eyes would meet and the resolve would crumble like ash. He'd find another reason to stay, another day to wait. His wounds needed more time, he'd say. The patrols were too heavy. The moon was too bright for a safe escape. They were lies, and they both knew it. The truth was simpler and far more terrifying. Neither of them wanted him to go. The old forge had become their entire world, a pocket of existence separate from the chaos outside. Within those crumbling stone walls, they weren't enemy and victim, Viking and villager. They were simply two people who'd found something unexpected in the wreckage of violence, something neither had words for, but both felt with crushing intensity. Eric told her about his childhood in the frozen north, about a father who'd been chief before him and had taught him that leadership meant carrying the weight of every decision, every death, every failure. "He died in battle when I was 19, Eric said one afternoon, his voice distant with memory. "I wasn't ready." No one is ever ready for that kind of responsibility. But in our culture, you don't get to choose. The mantle falls, and you either carry it or you're crushed beneath it. "Is that why you raid?" Freya asked, not accusingly, but genuinely trying to understand. "The weight of leadership? We raid because our lands are harsh and unforgiving, because winter lasts 8 months and the seas freeze solid, because our children go hungry if we don't." He looked at her, his blue eyes intense. "I'm not asking for forgiveness, Freya. What we did to your village, to your people, it was wrong. But desperation makes monsters of us all." Freya understood desperation better than he knew. She'd lived her entire life desperate to be seen, to be valued, to be something other than the strange girl who didn't fit. "We're all monsters and saints at different moments," she said softly. "Maybe that's what makes us human." He reached for her hand, lacing his fingers through hers. His hands were rough, scarred from battle and labor, but his touch was gentle. "In my world, we believe in fate, that every thread of every life is woven by the Norns, the goddesses of destiny. I used to think I understood my thread, where it led, how it would end. But then I opened my eyes and saw you, and suddenly everything I thought I knew became uncertain. Fate brought you here to die," Freya whispered. "No." His grip tightened. "Fate brought me here to live. Really live. Maybe for the first time." The kisses became more frequent, stolen moments of connection that felt like both salvation and damnation. Eric would pull her close in the dim light, his lips finding hers with a hunger that had nothing to do with the sparse meals she brought. Freya would lose herself in the solid warmth of him, in the way his hands traced the curve of her spine, in the low sound of appreciation he made when she pressed closer. They never went further than that, both understanding instinctively that some lines, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. But those kisses held entire conversations, promises and fears, and desperate hope all tangled together. Yet even as they built their fragile sanctuary, the shadows of duty grew longer. Eric's absence from his clan meant chaos. He knew it with the certainty of a leader who understood his people. Without him, the Jarls would fight for power, old feuds would reignite, and the carefully maintained peace between rival factions would shatter like thin ice. Men would die because he wasn't there to lead them. Families would suffer because he'd chosen to hide in an abandoned forge with a woman who should have been his enemy. The guilt ate at him. Freya could see it in the tension that crept into his shoulders when he thought she wasn't looking, in the way his jaw would clench when the wind carried sounds from the village. He was a man torn between two impossible choices, and the conflict was destroying him piece by piece. "You have to go," Freya said one night, forcing the words past the tightness in her throat. "Your people need you. Your absence is causing suffering. And what about you?" His voice was raw. "If I leave now, with the village watching your every move, they'll know something is wrong. They'll dig until they find the truth, and when they do, they'll kill you for treason. Then let them." She tried to sound brave, but her voice trembled. "I made my choice when I dragged you into this forge. I'd make it again." Eric stood abruptly, pacing like a caged wolf. "That's not acceptable. You don't get to sacrifice yourself for my conscience." He whirled to face her. "In my culture, we have a saying, a debt of life can only be repaid with life. You saved me. That means your life is mine to protect, even from the consequences of your own mercy." "That's not how it works," Freya argued, standing to meet him. "You don't own me, Eric. My choices are my own. Then choose to let me protect you." His frustration exploded into volume, his accent thickening with emotion. "Choose to be selfish for once in your selfless, stubborn, impossible life." They stood facing each other, both breathing hard, the air between them crackling with tension. Then Eric closed the distance and pulled her into his arms, not gently this time, but with desperate intensity. "I can't lose you," he said into her hair. "I can't go back to being the man I was before. Cold, hard, unbreakable iron with no warmth to temper it. You've ruined me, Freya. You've shown me what it means to feel, and now I can't unfeel it." Freya wrapped her arms around him, holding tight to this impossible man who'd become her entire world in the span of a few short weeks. "One day," she whispered against his chest, "under the same fire-red sky, you'll keep your promise. You'll come back." "I swear it," he said fiercely. "By the old gods and the new, by the blood in my veins and the breath in my lungs, I will return for you. And when I do, nothing will separate us again." The wind howled outside, cutting across the hills with winter's approaching bite. It carried the scent of smoke and salt, of endings and beginnings all mixed together. Somewhere in the village, Anders was gathering allies, spreading poison about the blacksmith's strange daughter and her suspicious behavior. Somewhere across the sea, Eric's clan was tearing itself apart in his absence. The world was moving toward collision. and their stolen moments of peace were running out like sand through desperate fingers. But in that moment, wrapped in each other's arms, they allowed themselves to believe in promises. They allowed themselves to imagine a future where love didn't have to be a battlefield, where two people from different worlds could forge something new from the broken pieces of the old. It was a foolish hope, perhaps. But hope, like iron, became strongest when tested by fire, and the fire was coming for them both. The change in the village was subtle at first, like the shift in air pressure before a storm. Freya noticed it in the way conversations died when she approached the well, in the sidelong glances that followed her through the market square. The mockery she'd endured her whole life had transformed into something darker, something that made her skin crawl with instinctive fear. Where once there had been cruel laughter, now there was only cold suspicion. Anders had been busy. The young man who'd once brought her wildflowers and stammered compliments had become her most dangerous enemy. He'd spent weeks planting seeds of doubt, watering them with half-truths and speculation until they'd grown into a garden of poison. He told people he'd seen lights in the old forge at odd hours. He wondered aloud why the blacksmith's daughter spent so much time alone when the village needed every pair of hands for rebuilding. He suggested, with false concern, that perhaps the raid had damaged more than just her home. "Maybe she's cursed," he'd say, his voice carrying just the right note of worried pity. "My grandmother says strange things happen to women who witness too much violence. Their minds break, and dark forces creep in through the cracks." The villagers, traumatized and looking for answers in a world that had suddenly become terrifying, latched onto his words like drowning men clutching driftwood. It was easier to believe in curses and corruption than to accept that violence was random, that safety was an illusion, that everything they'd built could be destroyed in a single night by men from across the sea. Freya felt the noose tightening with each passing day. People who'd once simply ignored her now actively avoided her, making signs against evil when she passed. Mothers pulled their children away from her path. Even her father, usually her strongest defender, seemed troubled, his weathered face creased with worry he couldn't quite articulate. "The village is talking," he said one evening as they worked the forge together, his voice heavy with concern. "They say you're hiding something, that you've been touched by darkness." Freya's hands never stopped moving, shaping the iron with practiced precision. "And what do you say, Father?" The old blacksmith was quiet for a long moment, the only sound the ring of hammer on anvil. "I say my daughter has always walked her own path, and that frightens people who only know how to follow. But, Freya," he paused, setting down his hammer to look at her directly, "if you're in trouble, if there's something you need to tell me, I would stand with you against the whole village. You know that, don't you?" Tears burned behind her eyes, but she blinked them back. "I know, Father. And that's why I can't tell you anything, because if they come for me, I won't have you fall too." His face crumpled with pain and understanding. He knew his daughter well enough to recognize when she'd made up her mind, when pushing would only drive her further away. "Then be careful," he whispered. "Please be careful." But careful wasn't enough anymore. That night, when Freya slipped away to the old forge, she found Eric pacing like a caged animal. He'd heard the rumors too, catching snatches of conversation from his hiding place when villagers passed too close to the abandoned building. "You need to let me go," he said before she could even set down the food she'd brought. "Tonight, now, before this gets any worse. If you leave now, they'll know something was here," Freya argued, though her heart wasn't in it. "They'll search the forge, find evidence of someone hiding. They'll put the pieces together. And if I stay, they'll find me anyway, and you'll die beside me." Eric's voice was rough with frustration and fear. For the first time since she'd known him, he looked genuinely afraid. Not of death or battle, but of being helpless to protect someone he cared about. "I've faced armies, Freya. I've sailed through storms that split ships in half. But this, watching you walk into danger because of me, I can't bear it." "Then we bear it together," she said firmly, moving to stand before him. "We've come this far. We don't give up now." He pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she could barely breathe. "You're the bravest person I've ever known," he murmured into her hair. "And the most foolish. I learned from the best. she said, managing a smile despite everything. Their kiss was desperate that night, flavored with fear and defiance. They clung to each other in the darkness, trying to memorize the feel and taste and warmth of each moment, knowing it might be their last. The knock came 3 days later, sharp and authoritative against the forge door where Freya worked beside her father. She looked up to see Anders standing with 4 other men, all carrying weapons, all wearing expressions of grim determination. "The council wants to speak with you," Anders announced, his voice formal but his eyes gleaming with vindictive satisfaction. "There are questions about your activities, about where you go at night, about what you might be hiding." Freya's father stepped forward, his bulk imposing despite his age. "My daughter answers to me, not to jumped-up boys playing at being soldiers. With respect, blacksmith, this isn't your decision." One of the older men spoke up, someone Freya recognized as a village elder. "We've had reports. Concerning reports. We need to investigate." "Investigate what?" Freya demanded, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I'm guilty of wanting solitude after watching my home burn, of needing time to grieve. We just want to search the old forge," Anders said, too quickly, too eagerly. "If there's nothing there, you have nothing to fear." Her blood turned to ice. They knew. Not everything perhaps, but enough to be dangerous. If they searched the forge now, they'd find Eric. They'd find the evidence of her treason, and both of them would die before sunset. "Then search it," she said, the words like glass in her throat. "I have nothing to hide." The lie tasted like ashes, but what choice did she have? If she refused, they'd know for certain something was wrong. Her only hope was that Eric had heard them coming, that he'd managed to hide himself somewhere even more secure, or that he'd finally done what she'd been begging him to do, and escaped. The march to the old forge felt like a funeral procession. Freya's father walked beside her, his hand on her shoulder in silent support. Anders led the way, practically bouncing with anticipation. The other men followed, weapons ready, expecting... what? A monster? A demon? Whatever Anders had convinced them lurked in the abandoned building. When they reached the forge, Anders pushed open the door with dramatic flourish. Sunlight streamed into the dusty interior, illuminating the old tools and abandoned equipment, the scraps of canvas and broken pottery. Everyone froze, peering into the shadows, searching for evidence of whatever darkness they'd convinced themselves existed. But the forge was empty, completely, utterly empty. No sign of Eric, no evidence of occupation, nothing but dust and memories and the smell of old smoke. Freya's knees nearly buckled with relief, but she kept her face carefully neutral. "Satisfied?" she asked, her voice dripping with disdain. Anders looked stricken, his face flushing with embarrassment and anger. He pushed past her, searching frantically, overturning canvas sheets and peering into corners. "He was here. I saw him. I saw her with him." "Saw who?" the elder asked, his patience clearly wearing thin. "The Viking, the one from the raid. She's been hiding him, healing him. I saw them together." The words hung in the air like an accusation. Freya felt everyone's eyes turn to her, saw the doubt creeping back into their expressions. Her father's hand tightened on her shoulder. "That's a serious accusation," another man said slowly. "Treason, if true." "It's not true," Freya said firmly. "It's the fantasy of a boy who can't accept rejection. I came here to be alone, that's all. There's no Viking, no conspiracy, just a girl trying to find peace in the aftermath of horror." But even as she spoke, she wondered, where was Eric? How had he known to leave? And more importantly, where had he gone? Under the floorboards, pressed into the narrow space beneath the forge's foundation, Eric lay perfectly still, barely breathing, listening to every word. Freya's voice, strong and defiant, made his heart ache with pride and terror. The old drainage pit he'd discovered days ago had saved his life, but it wouldn't hold forever. Soon he'd have to make a choice, stay hidden and watch Freya face danger alone, or reveal himself and doom them both. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, as the village stood at a crossroads between belief and doubt, between mercy and condemnation. The dawn broke gray and cold. The kind of mourning that felt like a held breath, like the world itself was waiting for something terrible to happen. Freya had barely slept, her mind racing with questions about Eric's disappearance. Had he finally left? Had he been discovered? The uncertainty gnawed at her like a physical pain, but she forced herself through the motions of normalcy, helping her father prepare the forge for another day's work. That's when the bells began to ring. Not the gentle morning bells that called villagers to prayer, but the harsh, frantic clanging of the alarm bells, the ones that meant only one thing: danger. Freya dropped the hammer she'd been holding and ran outside. Villagers were streaming toward the western edge of Skarn, pointing toward the coast, their faces painted with the same terror she remembered from that first night of fire and blood. Her stomach dropped as she understood what she was seeing. Ships. 3 long ships with striped sails, cutting through the morning mist like knives through silk. Vikings returning to finish what they'd started. The village erupted into chaos. Men scrambled for weapons, women grabbed children and ran for the forest, and the elderly froze in confusion, unable to process that the nightmare was happening again. Freya stood rooted to the spot, her mind spinning. Why were they back? What could they possibly want from a village they'd already destroyed? Then understanding hit her like a physical blow. They weren't here for plunder. They were here for their chief. They were here for Eric. She had to find him, had to warn him. If his own people discovered he'd been hiding in an enemy village, healing in secret while they believed him dead, they'd see it as betrayal. And betrayal among Vikings, from what Eric had told her, was punished with a death more terrible than any battlefield could offer. Freya ran toward the old forge, her lungs burning, her heart hammering against her ribs. She burst through the door, calling his name. "Eric, Eric, they're here! Your people are here!" Silence answered her. The forge was still empty, just as it had been when the villagers searched it. But now she noticed things she'd missed before in her relief. A scrap of cloth near the drainage pit, the disturbed dust around the hidden space beneath the floor. He'd been there, listening to everything, and then he'd left. "No," she whispered, dread coiling in her stomach. "No, no, no." She ran back outside and saw them, the Viking warriors already on the beach, forming ranks with military precision. They were here for vengeance, she realized. Without their leader to guide them, to temper their rage with strategy, they'd come for blood and blood alone. The village militia, such as it was, had formed a pathetic defensive line near the market square. Farmers with pitchforks, craftsmen with hammers, old men with rusted swords they barely remembered how to use. Against seasoned Viking warriors, they would last minutes at best. Freya pushed through the crowd, searching desperately for any sign of Eric. Where would he go? What would he do? Then she saw him, and her blood turned to ice. Eric stood between the two forces, alone in the no-man's land that separated village from raiders. He was still weak. She could see it in the slight tremor of his stance, the careful way he held himself. He wore no armor, carried no weapon. He was just a man standing in the path of war. "Hold!" he shouted, his voice carrying with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. The Vikings faltered, confusion rippling through their ranks. They'd come expecting battle, not to find their supposedly dead chief standing before them like a ghost. Eric, one of the warriors, stepped forward, a massive man with braided beard and scars that told stories of 100 battles. "By the gods, you're alive. We thought. The scout who survived said you fell in the first assault, that he saw you surrounded, saw you go down." "I fell," Eric confirmed, his voice steady despite the weakness Freya knew he must be feeling. "I nearly died, but I was saved." He paused, and Freya saw him take a deep breath, preparing to say something that would change everything. "Saved by one of them, by a woman from this village who found me bleeding and instead of finishing what we'd started, chose mercy." The silence that followed was absolute. Vikings and villagers alike stared in stunned disbelief. This was impossible, unthinkable. Leaders didn't admit vulnerability. Enemies didn't show mercy. The world didn't work that way. "You've been here?" the scarred warrior asked slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "All this time? While we thought you dead?" while we prepared for war among ourselves over who should lead in your absence. Yes. Eric's voice was firm, unapologetic, and I would make the same choice again. The woman who saved me showed me something our people have forgotten in our desperation. That mercy isn't weakness, that there's another way to be strong. This is madness, another Viking shouted. You're our chief. You don't hide among enemies like a coward. You don't accept help from those we're meant to conquer. The warriors began to advance, their intentions clear. Eric wasn't going to be welcomed as a returned leader. He was going to be punished as a traitor. Stop! Freya heard herself shouting before she could think better of it. She pushed through the villagers, running toward Eric despite the weapons, despite the danger, despite everything her survival instincts screamed at her to do. Stop. If you're going to kill someone for showing mercy, then kill me. I'm the one who saved him. I'm the one who chose compassion over revenge. Eric whirled to face her, his expression a mixture of fury and terror. Freya, no, get back! But she was already there, standing beside him, facing down two armies, with nothing but her conviction. I am Freya, daughter of the blacksmith, she announced, her voice ringing clear despite her fear. I found your chief dying among the ruins. I could have let him die. Part of me wanted to. But I'm not a murderer. I'm a healer. So I healed him. And if that makes me a traitor to my people, so be it. But at least I can face my reflection in the morning. Anders pushed forward from the village side, his face twisted with vindication. See? I told you. She admits it. She's been harboring the enemy. Enemy? Freya turned to face her own people now, her anger finally breaking free. Yes, they attacked us. Yes, they brought death and fire. But look at him. Really look. He's a man, just like your sons and brothers and fathers. He bleeds like we bleed. He suffers like we suffer. And when given the choice between revenge and mercy, I chose mercy. Because that's what makes us human, not the side we fight on. The scarred Viking warrior had reached them now, his sword drawn. You dare lecture us about humanity, girl? We came here to avenge our chief, to burn this village to ash in his memory. And we find him standing here defending the people who should have killed him? Then burn it, Eric said quietly, but with steel underneath. Burn it all. Kill everyone. Kill me too while you're at it. But understand this, if you do, you prove that everything I've learned here is wrong, that we are nothing but animals, incapable of anything but violence and death. Is that who you want to be? The warrior hesitated, his sword wavering. Around them, Vikings and villagers alike stood frozen, caught between old hatreds and new possibilities. The moment stretched like heated metal, ready to be shaped or shattered. Then chaos erupted. A young Viking, too eager or too angry to wait, lunged forward with his axe raised. Eric moved to intercept, still too weak, too slow. Freya screamed, throwing herself between them without thinking. She felt the impact, felt herself falling, felt Eric catch her as they went down together in a tangle of limbs and desperation. The blade had missed her by inches, embedding itself in the ground beside her head. But the damage was done. Both sides surged forward, weapons raised, all pretense of peace shattered. The battle Eric had tried to prevent erupted around them like a wildfire, consuming everything in its path. As steel met steel and screams filled the air, Eric pulled Freya close, covering her body with his own. I'm sorry, he whispered against her hair. I'm so sorry. I tried to protect you. We tried together, she whispered back, clinging to him as their world fell apart for the second time. Under the same fire-red sky, just like you promised. Around them, the sky did turn red, smoke and flame painting it in shades of destruction. But this time, Freya wasn't alone in the chaos. This time, she had someone worth fighting for, worth dying for. And somehow, impossibly, that made all the difference. The battle ended as quickly as it had begun, but not because either side had won. Eric had fought with a desperation Freya had never seen, throwing himself between his own warriors and the villagers with such ferocity that it shocked both armies into hesitation. He'd disarmed 3 of his men, shouting orders in Norse that gradually, reluctantly, began to be obeyed. The scarred warrior, whose name Freya learned was Bjorn, had finally called for a ceasefire, his respect for Eric's courage apparently outweighing his anger at the perceived betrayal. But the cost of that hesitation was everything. When the dust settled and weapons were lowered, Eric was seized by his own men. Not gently, not with the reverence due a chief, but with the rough efficiency reserved for prisoners. They bound his hands with leather straps, forced him to his knees in the mud and ash. Freya tried to reach him, but villagers held her back, their grips iron hard despite her struggles. "Treason," Bjorn announced, his voice carrying across the sudden silence. "Eric Halvordsson, you are accused of abandoning your people, of consorting with the enemy, of placing a woman above the honor of your clan. The punishment is death at dawn." A roar of approval went up from the Viking ranks. These were men who'd spent weeks believing their leader dead, who'd nearly torn their own clan apart fighting over succession. Finding him alive but changed, softened by mercy and compassion, felt like a betrayal worse than death. On the village side, the reaction was equally vehement. Anders pushed forward, pointing an accusing finger at Freya. And what about her? She admitted it herself. She sheltered the enemy, nursed him back to health while our people suffered. That's treason too. The village elder, a man named Thomas, who'd known Freya since she was a child, stepped forward with a heavy expression. "The girl will face the council. If she's found guilty of aiding the raiders, she'll be executed as well." "That is our law." "No!" Eric's voice cracked like a whip, drawing every eye. Even bound and kneeling, he commanded attention. "She saved my life. If that's a crime, then the crime is mine alone. Let her go." "You don't give orders here anymore," Bjorn said coldly. "You gave up that right when you chose her over us." Freya was dragged away, her father's anguished shouts following her as they hauled her toward the village hall where the council convened. She caught one last glimpse of Eric, his ice-blue eyes finding hers across the chaos, holding a world of regret and desperate love. Then the door slammed shut between them, and she was alone with her accusers. The council chamber smelled of smoke and fear. The elders sat in a semicircle, their faces grave, while Anders paced like a predator finally cornering wounded prey. Freya stood in the center, her hands unbound but her escape routes blocked by armed men at every door. "You don't deny it?" Thomas asked, his voice heavy with disappointment. "I don't," Freya said, lifting her chin. "I found a dying man. I chose to save him. I'd do it again. Even knowing he led the raid that killed your neighbors, that burned your home." Another elder, a woman named Margaret, whose son had died in the attack, spoke with barely controlled rage. "Even knowing that," Freya met her eyes steadily, "because if I'd let him die, I would have become exactly what we accuse them of being. A murderer, someone who sees enemies instead of people." "Noble sentiments from a traitor," Anders spat. "While you played healer with your Viking, the rest of us were trying to rebuild what they destroyed. Do you know how many children still have nightmares? How many widows weep themselves to sleep?" "I know," Freya said quietly. "I hear them too, every night. But adding one more body to the pile wouldn't have brought anyone back. It wouldn't have made the nightmares stop." "It would have been justice," Margaret said, tears streaming down her weathered face. "No, it would have been revenge. There's a difference." The debate raged for hours, voices rising and falling like waves against stone. Some argued for immediate execution. Others, surprisingly, spoke in Freya's defense, pointing out that mercy was a virtue their faith preached even if they rarely practiced it. Her father stood outside, forbidden from entering but making his presence felt, his voice carrying through the walls as he defended his daughter with every ounce of his being. As night fell, Freya was led to a storage cellar that had been converted into a makeshift prison. They locked her in with rough efficiency, leaving her alone in the darkness with only her thoughts for company. She wondered if Eric was in a similar cell, if he was thinking of her, if he regretted the promise he'd made under that fire-red sky. Hours passed. Freya dozed fitfully, exhaustion finally overwhelming fear. She dreamed of the forge, of iron glowing white-hot, of Eric's hands covering hers as they shaped metal together into something beautiful and strong. She woke to the sound of the lock being worked. Her heart leapt, hope and terror warring in her chest. Had they come to execute her early, to offer her a chance to escape? The door swung open and her father stood there, a ring of keys in his weathered hands and guilt written across his face. "I'm getting you out," he whispered urgently. "The guard owes me a debt and I called it in. You need to run, Freya. Run and don't look back." "Father, no. If they find out you helped me, then they find out. You're my daughter, my only child." "I won't stand by and watch them kill you for having a bigger heart than the rest of us combined." He grabbed her hand, pressing something cold and metallic into her palm. A knife, small but sharp. "There's a horse waiting at the north gate. Take it. Ride to the coast. Maybe you can find passage on a merchant ship. Start over somewhere far from here." Freya looked at the knife, then at her father's face, seeing the love and desperation etched into every line. "What about Eric? What about him? He's not your concern anymore. He's the man I love." The words came out fierce and certain, surprising even herself with their conviction. "I can't leave him to die. Not after everything." Her father's face crumpled. "Freya, please. He's surrounded by his own warriors. Even if you could reach him, what could you do?" "I don't know," she admitted, "but I have to try. Love isn't something you abandon when it becomes inconvenient or dangerous." "You taught me that. You loved Mother through the fever, stayed by her side even when everyone said you should leave before it took you too. And I lost her anyway," he said, his voice breaking. "But you didn't lose yourself. That's what matters." Freya embraced him, feeling his arms wrap around her one last time. "Thank you, Father, for everything. For teaching me to work iron. For never trying to make me into something I wasn't. For loving me even when I made it difficult. Especially then," he whispered into her hair. "Especially then." They separated, both knowing it might be the last time. Freya slipped out into the night, moving with the silence her years of solitary wandering had taught her. The village was quiet, most people asleep or huddled in their homes, trying to pretend the world wasn't falling apart again. The Viking camp was on the beach, fires burning low, guards posted at regular intervals. Freya approached from the north, using the rocks and dunes for cover, her heart hammering so hard she was certain everyone could hear it. She spotted Eric easily, bound to a post near the largest fire, his head bowed, but his posture still proud. Getting to him seemed impossible. There were at least 20 warriors between her and Eric, all armed, all alert. But Freya had spent her whole life doing impossible things. She'd learned to forge steel as strong as any man's. She'd saved an enemy's life and fallen in love with him. She'd stood between two armies and lived to tell about it. She could do this too. Using the knife her father had given her, she cut through the back of the tent nearest Eric's position. She slipped inside, found a cloak and helmet, and emerged disguised as a young warrior. In the darkness, with her height and build, she could pass for a slender man. She walked with purpose toward Eric, her heart in her throat, praying to any god who might be listening. She reached him without challenge. The guards were watching the perimeter, not expecting threat from within their own camp. With quick, precise movements, she cut his bonds, caught him as he stumbled, and whispered in his ear, "We're leaving. Now. Don't argue." Eric's eyes went wide with recognition and horror. "Freya, you can't." "I just did. Come on." They made it 3 steps before the alarm was raised. Someone had noticed the movement, the irregularity. Shouts erupted across the camp, warriors scrambling for weapons. Freya and Eric ran, hand in hand, toward the darkness beyond the firelight. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, closer, inevitable. They wouldn't make it. Freya knew it with crushing certainty. But at least they were together. At least she'd tried. They didn't make it far. Within minutes, Viking warriors had surrounded them, their torches creating a circle of flickering light that felt like the boundary between life and death. Freya and Eric stood back to back, her small knife pathetic against the arsenal of weapons pointed at them. But she held it steady anyway, her jaw set with defiance that would have made her father proud. Bjorn pushed through the circle, his face a mask of fury and something that might have been disappointment. "You've condemned yourself, Eric. And for what? For her." He spat the last word like poison. "We could have shown mercy, could have exiled you, let you live out your days in disgrace. But this, escaping like a thief in the night, this is unforgivable. Before Eric could respond, shouts erupted from the village side. The commotion had woken the entire settlement, and now villagers poured toward the beach, armed with whatever they could grab, led by Anders and the council members. They saw Freya and Eric surrounded, saw the Vikings preparing for execution, and rage overcame their fear. "The traitor is ours to punish," Anders shouted, pointing at Freya. "You don't get to take that from us. She's committed crimes against your people, and he against ours," Bjorn called back. "Let each of us handle our own justice." The two groups converged on the beach, creating a larger circle with Freya and Eric at its center. Torchlight painted everything in shades of orange and shadow, making the scene feel ancient and timeless, as if they were participating in a ritual as old as violence itself. The waves crashed behind them, indifferent to human drama, continuing their eternal rhythm while lives hung in the balance. Thomas stepped forward, his elderly frame somehow commanding respect from both sides. "Bring them to the village square," he ordered. "If we're to do this, we'll do it properly. Both peoples present. Both judgments passed. Let there be no question of legitimacy." And so they were marched back through Skarn, a procession of condemned and condemners, Vikings and villagers walking side by side in grim purpose. Freya's hand found Eric's, their fingers intertwining despite the bonds that had been replaced on his wrists. He squeezed gently, a silent communication of love and regret and desperate hope. The village square had been hastily prepared. 2 posts had been driven into the ground, and Freya and Eric were forced to their knees before them, separated by several feet but positioned so they could see each other. The crowd gathered around them, a sea of hostile faces illuminated by dozens of torches that made the night bright as noon. Bjorn stood to address the Vikings. "Eric Halvardsson, you are accused of abandoning your duty, of placing personal desire above the needs of your people, of betraying the trust we placed in you as our chief. How do you answer these charges?" Eric's voice rang clear and strong despite his position. "I answer that mercy is not betrayal, that choosing life over death, healing over vengeance, is not weakness. If that makes me unworthy to lead, then I was never worthy to begin with." Murmurs rippled through the Viking ranks, some angry, others thoughtful. Before anyone could respond, Thomas turned to address the villagers. "Freya, daughter of the blacksmith, you are accused of treason, of harboring our enemy, of placing his life above the safety and justice of your own people. What is your defense?" Freya lifted her head, her voice steady. "I have no defense, only the truth. I found a dying man and chose to save him because that's what healers do. That's what humans do, or should do. If being human is a crime, then I'm guilty." "Noble words from a traitor's mouth," Anders snarled, pushing forward. "While you played nurse to the monster who burned our homes, the rest of us suffered. You deserve death." "Perhaps," Freya acknowledged, "but so do you by that logic. So does everyone here who's ever chosen revenge over forgiveness, violence over peace. We're all guilty of something, Anders. The only difference is I'm willing to admit it." The crowd erupted in arguments, Vikings and villagers alike shouting accusations and defenses, old grievances surfacing like corpses from shallow graves. The noise built to a crescendo, and then, "Enough!" The command came from Eric, somehow cutting through the chaos. "If you're going to kill us, then do it. But first, hear me out. All of you. Both sides." Silence fell, tense and expectant. Eric struggled to his feet despite the bonds, standing tall even in defeat. "I have led men into battle. I have ordered raids, killed enemies, done things I'm not proud of in the name of survival. I thought I understood strength, thought it meant never backing down, never showing weakness, never admitting doubt." He paused, his eyes finding Freya's. "Then I met her, and she showed me that real strength isn't about never falling. It's about what you do when you're down, who you become when everything you thought you knew is stripped away." "This is sentiment, not leadership," Bjorn interrupted. "We need a chief who's strong, not one who's been softened by—" "She didn't soften me." Eric's voice cracked like thunder. "She showed me what I'd forgotten in all those years of ice and blood and survival, that we're human first, Viking second. That honor doesn't mean dying pointlessly, it means living deliberately, that the strongest chains aren't made of iron, but of loyalty and love, and the choice to stand beside someone even when the whole world tells you to walk away. He turned to face his people fully. You want to kill me for choosing her? Fine, do it. But know that you're killing the only version of me that was worth saving. The version that finally understood what we've been fighting for all these years. Not just land or gold or glory, but the right to live fully, to love freely, to be more than just warriors waiting to die. The words hung in the air like smoke. Freya felt tears streaming down her face, not from fear but from the raw honesty of his declaration. Around them she could see the crowd shifting, faces changing from anger to uncertainty, to something that might have been understanding. Then the blade was drawn. A Viking warrior stepped forward, his sword catching the torchlight. Enough talk, he growled. Justice demands blood. Let's be done with this. He moved toward Freya, not Eric, perhaps thinking her the easier target. The blade rose and Freya closed her eyes, preparing for the end. She'd lived more in these past weeks than in all her previous years combined. If this was the price, she'd pay it gladly. No! Eric's roar shattered the night. He threw himself forward despite his bonds, despite the warriors holding him, with such force that he broke free. He crashed into the swordsman, taking the blow meant for Freya across his own back. Blood bloomed across his tunic, dark and terrible, and he fell. Eric! Freya's scream was raw, primal. She lunged toward him, and this time no one stopped her. She cradled his head in her lap, her hands coming away red, her whole world narrowing to his face, his eyes, his labored breathing. I told you, he whispered, managing a pained smile. Under the same fire-red sky, I'd keep my promise. I'd protect you. You're not dying, Freya said fiercely, pressing her hands against the wound, trying to stem the flow. I saved you once. I'll save you again. Just stay with me. Please, Eric, stay with me. Around them, something fundamental had shifted. Vikings and villagers alike stood frozen, watching this display of desperate love, seeing perhaps for the first time the human cost of their cycle of violence. The warrior who'd struck the blow stood with his sword lowered, looking sick. Then a voice cut through the shock. Freya's father pushing through the crowd, carrying something wrapped in cloth. He knelt beside his daughter, beside the man who'd brought death to their village, and unwrapped the cloth to reveal a sword. Not just any sword, but one of Freya's own making, forged in secret over months of solitary work, tempered with skills she'd spent a lifetime perfecting. This blade, the old blacksmith said, his voice carrying to every corner of the square, was made by a traitor, they say. Made by my daughter who chose mercy over vengeance, healing over hate. He lifted it high, the steel catching the light, perfect and deadly and beautiful. But I say it was forged by someone who understands what none of us seem to anymore. That strength and compassion aren't opposites. That you can be hard as steel and still choose not to cut. That being able to kill and choosing not to is the truest form of power. He turned slowly, making eye contact with Vikings and villagers alike. My daughter saved this man's life, and tonight he tried to save hers. If that's treason, then I'm proud to have raised a traitor, and if you're going to execute them for loving each other across the boundaries we've drawn, then you'll have to execute me too, because I won't live in a world that punishes love and rewards hate. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, slowly, Bjorn stepped forward. The scarred warrior looked at Eric bleeding in Freya's arms, looked at the father willing to die for his daughter's choice, and something in his weathered face cracked. Perhaps, he said slowly, we've all forgotten what honor truly means. The sun rose slowly over Skarn, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, softer than the violent crimson that had marked the beginning of this story. Freya watched it climb above the horizon from the window of her father's workshop, her hands still stained with Eric's blood despite hours of washing. The wound had been deep but not fatal, missing vital organs by what the village healer called a miracle. But what Freya knew was simply Eric's instinct to twist away at the last second, to take a glancing blow rather than a killing strike. He'd survived the night. They both had. And with the dawn came something Freya had never dared hope for: peace. It hadn't come easily or quickly. After her father's declaration, the square had erupted in heated debate that lasted until the sky began to lighten. Some Vikings demanded Eric's exile, arguing that a chief who chose love over duty couldn't lead. Some villagers wanted Freya banished, unable to forgive what they saw as betrayal. But slowly, painfully, voices of reason began to emerge from both sides. Bjorn had been the first to truly shift the tide. The scarred warrior had knelt beside Eric's unconscious form and spoken words that would become legend in both cultures. "I have followed you into 50 battles, Eric Halvardsson. I have seen you face death without flinching, lead men through storms that would break lesser chiefs. But tonight, I saw you do something harder than any of that. You stood for what you believed was right, even knowing it would cost you everything. That is true courage. That is the kind of chief worth following." Others had joined their voices to his. Warriors who remembered Eric's fairness, his strategic brilliance, his refusal to allow unnecessary cruelty even in conquest. They spoke of how the clan had nearly torn itself apart in his absence, how old feuds had resurfaced, how they needed his steady hand. From the village side, unexpected allies emerged. Margaret, the woman who'd lost her son in the raid, had stepped forward with tears streaming down her weathered face. "My boy is gone," she'd said, her voice breaking. "Nothing will bring him back. Not vengeance, not blood, not hatred. But maybe his death doesn't have to be meaningless. Maybe it can be the last death, instead of just another in an endless cycle." The debate had continued through the night, but gradually, impossibly, consensus formed. A truce would be declared. Eric would remain chief, but with the understanding that future raids on Skarn were forbidden. The village would provide limited trade goods, and in exchange, the Vikings would offer protection from other raiders. It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was a beginning. Now, 3 weeks later, that beginning had taken root and begun to grow. The village square bustled with activity that would have seemed impossible mere days ago. Vikings and villagers worked side by side, rebuilding homes that the raids had destroyed. The work was awkward at first, centuries of enmity not easily overcome, but shared labor had a way of breaking down walls that words alone couldn't breach. Freya moved through the crowd, no longer an outcast, but not quite accepted either. She existed in a strange liminal space, respected for her skill, but still regarded with wary uncertainty. She'd discovered she didn't mind. After everything, the opinions of people who'd mocked her for years felt less important than the work of her own hands. Those hands were busy now with the most ambitious project she'd ever undertaken. With her father's blessing and Eric's encouragement, she was building a new forge at the edge of the village, larger than the old one, designed to accommodate 2 smiths working side by side. The structure rose slowly from the ashes of the old, stone by stone, a monument to possibility. Eric found her there as the afternoon light slanted golden through the partially completed roof. He moved carefully still, his wound not fully healed, but the color had returned to his face and the strength to his stride. He wore simple clothes now, having set aside his armor except for ceremonial occasions, and Freya thought he'd never looked more handsome than he did covered in honest sweat and sawdust. "You're supposed to be resting," she said, without looking up from the beam she was securing. "I've rested enough for 3 lifetimes." He came to stand beside her, his presence warm and solid. "Besides, I promised to help build this. A man of honor keeps his promises." "You've kept enough promises already," Freya said softly, finally meeting his eyes. "You came back for me, just like you said you would, under the same fire-red sky." Eric's hand found hers, his thumb tracing patterns on her palm. The sky wasn't red this morning. It was gold and pink and gentle, like a new beginning. "Do you miss the old sky, the fire and blood and certainty of it all?" He was quiet for a moment, considering. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Violence is simpler than peace. Hatred is easier than forgiveness. But simple and easy aren't the same as right." He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. "My people have a saying, the strongest steel is forged in the hottest fire. We were forged in fire, you and I. Everything we went through, all the pain and fear and impossible choices, They made us who we are, made us worthy of this. And what is this exactly? Freya asked, though she knew, had known for weeks, maybe from that first moment when she'd looked into his ice-blue eyes and chosen mercy over vengeance. Everything, Eric said simply. He pulled her close and she went willingly, resting her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. A life together, a forge where we can create instead of destroy, a chance to prove that love can be stronger than hate, that two people from different worlds can build something new. They stood like that for a long moment, wrapped in each other's arms while the village moved around them. Some people still stared, still whispered, but others had begun to smile, to see in Freya and Eric not a scandal, but a symbol. If a Viking chief and a blacksmith's daughter could find love across such a divide, perhaps anything was possible. As evening approached, bringing with it the communal meal that had become tradition, Eric and Freya walked hand in hand toward the village square. The feast was modest, resources still stretched thin from rebuilding, but there was laughter now, conversation that flowed more easily each day. Children who'd hidden in terror from Vikings weeks ago now played at their feet, too young to carry grudges, teaching their elders by example how to move forward. Freya's father approached them, a rare smile creasing his weathered face. In his hands he carried 2 matching rings, simple bands of iron that gleamed in the firelight. "I made these," he said gruffly, "from the first sword you forged together. Seemed fitting." Eric took one, examining it with the eye of someone who understood metalwork. "It's perfect," he said. "Thank you." The old blacksmith nodded, then surprised everyone by pulling Eric into a brief, fierce embrace. "You take care of my daughter," he said quietly, "or I'll remake you into a horseshoe, chief or no chief." "I wouldn't expect anything less," Eric replied, his respect genuine and deep. As the stars emerged overhead, Eric slipped the ring onto Freya's finger, and she did the same for him. There was no formal ceremony, no priest or ritual, just the simple exchange of promises between two people who'd earned the right to make them. Around them, Vikings and villagers raised their cups in toast, celebrating not just a union, but the possibility it represented. Later, when the fires had burned low and the crowd had dispersed, Freya and Eric climbed the hill overlooking the village. From there they could see everything. The rebuilt homes, the new forge rising from the ruins, the beach where longships and fishing boats now rested peacefully side by side. The sky was clear, stars scattered like diamonds across velvet, and the moon painted everything in silver light. "Look," Eric said softly, pointing toward the horizon where the last traces of sunset lingered. "The sky is burning again." Freya looked and saw what he meant. The horizon glowed with soft reds and oranges, beautiful and warm rather than violent and destructive. "The same fire-red sky," she murmured, "but different now." "Yes," Eric agreed, pulling her close. "Now it's the fire that warms instead of the fire that destroys. The fire that forges instead of the fire that consumes." He kissed her then, tender and full of promise. A kiss that tasted of future rather than past. When they finally pulled apart, Freya rested her head on his shoulder, feeling more at peace than she'd ever thought possible. "We did it," she whispered. "We actually did it. We survived," Eric corrected gently. "We chose each other when it would have been easier to walk away. We stood together when the whole world told us to stand apart. That's not just surviving, Freya. That's living." And he was right. Their love hadn't been legend or miracle, nothing granted by gods or fate. It had been messy and difficult and born of impossible circumstances. It had cost them both dearly, had nearly destroyed them, had forced them to face down armies and prejudice and their own fears. But it had been real, utterly and completely real, and that made it stronger than any fairy tale. The wind picked up, carrying the mingled scents of iron and salt, of forge fires and sea spray, of two worlds learning to exist as one. It whispered through the grass around them, and in that whisper, Freya heard the echo of everything they'd overcome, everything they'd fought for, everything they'd become. Under the same fire-red sky where their story began, where death had nearly claimed them both. They'd found something neither had been looking for, but both desperately needed. They'd found each other. They'd found home. And most importantly, they'd found proof that love, real love, could overcome even the deepest divides. As they walked back down the hill toward the village, toward the forge they would share and the life they would build together, the sky continued its slow fade from red to purple, to the deep blue of night. The fire remained, would always remain, but now it burned with warmth and light rather than destruction. And that, Freya thought as Eric's hand tightened around hers, made all the difference. And so ends the story of Freya and Eric, two souls who proved that the strongest walls we build are not made of stone, but of prejudice and fear. Their love wasn't written in the stars or blessed by destiny. It was forged in fire, tempered by sacrifice, and shaped by the simple choice to see humanity in the face of an enemy. They taught us that mercy isn't weakness, that compassion takes more courage than violence ever could, and that sometimes the bravest thing we can do is choose love when the entire world demands we choose hate. But now I ask you, what would you have done in Freya's place? When you stumbled upon that dying warrior, the man responsible for your suffering, would you have walked away? Would you have let justice take its course? Or would you have risked everything for a stranger's life? And when the world condemned you for that choice, when even those you loved turned against you, would you have stood firm in your conviction? These aren't easy questions, and perhaps that's the point. The most important choices never are. If this story moved you, if it made you feel something real, then please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that remind us what it means to be human, to love deeply, to choose bravely. Because in the end, we're all just trying to find our own fire-red sky, our own moment where we must decide who we want to be. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Until the next story, remember, love is not the absence of fear, but the courage to choose it anyway.